I'd like to outline, it's many dimensions, but I'd like to outline just 8 major ones very briefly, maybe a minute or so each. First, at the very basic, at the root level, there is the local or / regional dimension, whereby it is a struggle between an indigenous population and which are mostly Armenian, and relatively new settlers, which are the Azeris, which actually themselves are the various different tribes, and it's a relatively recent phenomenon as a country. But the settler phenomenon has longer history than the country, but still recent relative to the indigenous population. Now, what the indigenous population has is a very long history, is a culture, it very deep roots to the land. For it, it's a homeland. It's not real estate. For the recent settlers, it has 2 major strengths. Number one, the enclave is recognized as part of Azerbaijan. Okay, I'll come to that in the second issue. And number 2, it has superior military force right now. The third dimension, which the good general addressed to some extent, is the broader geopolitical dimension of this. If you look at the map that he had put, and unfortunately I don't have a map, but I think it's still vivid in the minds of people who were listening to the general. There is a north-south axis and there's an east-west or west-east axis. The west-east axis is from basically Europe, but via Turkey being the main player. There is the second dimension, which is worth mentioning, and that's going to take a very long time to do, so I will very briefly touch on it, is the legal dimension. There is no defensible legal basis to have Azerbaijan, to have Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. Now, this is very complicated because there are different international laws that govern how internal borders of a large political entity become external borders or international borders once that big political entity disintegrates and evolves into its different component parts. In this case, Soviet Union, there were internal borders during the Soviet time between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And once Armenia and Azerbaijan became independent states after the collapse of the Soviet Union, those internal borders were taken as a guide to create the international border between the two. The problem with this, and the 2 problems with this, number one, that Armenia before the Soviet Union was an independent state, and the League of Nations has the first comprehensive map recognized by the League of Nations of Armenia, in which, by the way, both Nakhichevan and Nagorno-Karabakh were part of Armenia at the time. So that's one problem. Second problem is the internal borders when it was Soviet Union changed so many times. The borders in 1920 were different than in 1921, then different than in 1922. The borders changed again in 1926. They changed again in 1932, and so on and so forth. So there is the issue of, okay, even if you're going to use the internal borders and to make them international, which ones do you use? There are all kinds of legal complications here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that there is no way to legally defend the status of Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. The geopolitical, to combine this north-south, east-west axis geopolitics with the trade routes. This is how, by the way, both India and China and Europe, and they all get interested in this topic, okay? Because at the very center of the north-south and east-west axis is Armenia and Artsakh. If you look at the map, it's right in the middle of the crosshairs of those 2 axes. The fourth dimension of this is the multilateral diplomatic efforts that took place. As many of you who have followed the conflict know, there was for a long time the OSCE Minsk group with 3 co-chairs United States, France, and Russia being co-chairs of the Minsk group, trying to negotiate a peace settlement between Azerbaijan and Armenia on the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh. In those days, Armenia was kind of at the seat instead of Nagorno-Karabakh representing the interest of Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians. But this was aside from the three co-chairs, Belarus, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Finland, Turkey were actually part of it too, and Azerbaijan was part of that Minsk group, but the co-chairs were running the negotiations. All this diplomatic effort, as you know, didn't go very far. There were sometimes, seemed like there was going to be progress, but then in 2020, Azerbaijan took matters in its own hands and did the war. Now, this brings me to the military dimension, which the general addressed. And all I want to do is emphasize that this was perhaps the most unequal battle in recent history. First of all, Azeri forces outnumber Armenia by a very large percentage, up to almost four times back in 2020. But that's not the only thing. Armenia had managed to deal with that in the past, like the general said, back in the early 90s. But Azerbaijan had full logistical and planning support from Turkey. Turkey is the second largest NATO army, with all the NATO military capabilities attached to it. There were, in addition to just the logistical and planning support, there were over 1,000 elite Turkish troops involved in the fighting in 2020. There were a few thousand jihadist mercenaries brought by Turkey, also fighting. Higher military expenditures by tens of billions of dollars Azerbaijan had than Armenia. There were also serious input here from Israel, both Israeli military hardware, drones, but also military intelligence gathering and sharing. Then there was also full cooperation from Georgia, Armenia's northern neighbor, in the form of Georgia totally kept its airspace open for military airplanes, equipment to fly from Israel over Georgia into Baku. Now, Azerbaijan is a major oil and gas producer, not as major, by the way, as it likes people to think, because there's some exaggeration of the potential of Azerbaijan, especially gas. But there are several major infrastructure, multi-billion projects which have tied Western commercial interests to the interests of Azerbaijan. And that was a major factor in the war, and that's a major factor in the overall geopolitical thinking and in the publicity that goes with it. The Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, operated by British Petroleum, where partners are British Petroleum, SOCAR, which is the Azeri oil company, Chevron, Turkish Petroleum Company, ENI, Total, Itochu, Impex, ConocoPhillips, Hess. What you can see here is a partnership between Turkish, Azeri oil companies and a lot of Western oil companies. So the Western oil company interests and the Azeri oil and Turkish oil company interests are tied together here. The Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum gas pipeline, again operated by British Petroleum. It's one of the reasons why Britain has been all along, not just Britain, the BBC has been all along very pro-Azeri in its rhetoric and in its narrative. The Baku-Supsa pipeline, again, operator British Petroleum. British Petroleum is heavily invested in Azerbaijan. Okay? And again, partners SOCAR and the Azerbaijan International Operating Company. Nabucco gas pipeline. Here, partners are BOTAŞ, which is Turkish, Bulgarian, Austrian, and Romanian oil companies, and so on and so forth. So there is, let's not forget the hydrocarbons, petroleum, and the gas dimension of this conflict, which has affected the outcome and the narrative. I'd like to stress a seventh very important dimension, which is the ethnic cleansing dimension. Now, lately, as the general said, over 100,000 people left their ancestral homes. Okay, that's a very key initial part of the ethnic cleansing. But Azerbaijan has a very interesting history of erasing everything, every trace of Armenian past in the land. They did this in Nakhichevan. In Nakhichevan, that enclave on the western part of Azerbaijan used to be part of Armenia. When the Armenians were pushed out, just like they were pushed out now from Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan went and very methodically eliminated 28,000 Armenian monuments from that region. I can be very precise here because it's been documented: 89 churches, 5,840 cross stones, 22,000 tombstones. So today you go to Nakhichevan, they say, what? There were no Armenians here. This is indigenous Azerbaijani land. This brings me back to the very first dimension. The reason I stress the first dimension, which is the indigenous population versus the settlers, is because this urge to erase even every trace of the indigenous population is to, in a way, manipulate history, to change, to come up, and to this day, Aliyev still says that this is historic Azeri lands. Armenians came here, they're the Johnny-come-latelys, we were here first. Okay? Now, the same fate awaits Nagorno-Karabakh. In Nagorno-Karabakh, there are 370 Armenian churches. There are 119 Armenian fortresses. There are over 240 Armenian cemeteries, from starting with the 2nd century BC all the way to the 18th century. Now, this is at risk because if their past behavior in Nakhichevan, which was 100 years ago, is any indication, this is going to happen again. And again, it's been driven by an urge to fight history, to change history, and to create its own narrative. And here, this brings me to the 8th dimension, which is the information war. The Azerbaijani propaganda machine has been working overnight since the 2020 war. The narrative has been incredibly changed and influenced by them, by the way. They spent much more resources than Armenia ever has. Even the Armenian diaspora, which is involved in the lobbying here and there, and more advocacy groups than lobbying groups, but cannot match the financial resources that Azerbaijan has. The interesting thing is that these 8 dimensions that I mentioned are all related with each other, combined, and one reinforces the other. I think my time is up, Paul. I'd like to stop here, and if there are any questions, I'd like to be able to actually address during the question-answer period or some of the other speakers the issue of this famous Zangezur corridor, because that has both geopolitical and trade and all kinds of other implications. Thank you.